Hey, I'm Mike. Welcome to Need It Make It. If you're an owner of a Creality Ender 3 version 3 model KE, a fast bed slinger with a lot of good features and some good potential as well, you may be struggling with the quality of your 3D prints. In this video, we're going to see if we can figure out what is causing the poor quality with PETG and some PLA prints as well, and what exactly we need to do to fix it. So, stick around. This video is a continuation of my previous video on this printer, which was more of a full review. That one will be linked up there if you wanted to check that one out. And while testing this printer, we had some good results with PLA and we had some good results with one of the 3 PETG filaments that I tested. I've printed hundreds and hundreds of prints with PETG and I have not seen these kinds of problems. So it was a bit baffling to me. So what we need to do is tick off the possible causes one at a time. Now, after taking apart the extruder in the last video, it looked like that could be a factor. The hot end and the nozzles are the same ones that I used on my K1, and the results on the K1 have been very good so far, so I don't believe that that is the source at the moment. So let's start with the extruder. My plan is to take the extruder from the K1 and retrofit it into this printer, and we should be able to see if using a different extruder, which is designed to print at high speed, solves the issues we're running into. I also have a nice LGX large gear extruder from Bondtech that I'd like to use as well, but it's heavier and it also would require a special micro 1mm spacing 4-pin adapter wire to use it, so I think that's going to have to be a last resort. This is the extruder from my K1. I've since replaced it with a new extruder. There's been a couple versions of this particular extruder, but this one's still in good condition. It doesn't look good, but it seemed like it fit fairly well onto the original stepper motor that came off of this. All right, so we have a bit of a problem here. The original Sprite extruder was able to sit down quite a bit lower, so we're gonna need to ditch the cover and rig something up to make sure that we can make it work for this test. I've created a simple bracket from ABS, and then with some heat set inserts, we should be able to mount this onto the existing bracket, and it should be stiff enough, I think, to do the job. So I've just rigged this up temporarily. We'll see if this actually works, and if we can get it to work, then that means that we can start to dial in some of the settings, because I think the gear ratios are going to be completely different between the 2 extruder setups. So let's go ahead, we're going to test some things out, see if we can get this to work, and if we can, we may need to root this printer and be able to access the configuration file. Okay, so that does confirm that we have a problem. Unfortunately, this setup here has the opposite rotation of the original. And it must be because the K1 extruder has one more gear in here than this one does, which causes that rotation to reverse. Okay, so what we need to do now is go through the process of rooting this, and then we'll gain access to the configuration file. So I have rooted the printer, I have gained access to the configuration file through Fluid. I can't actually remember if it's Fluid or main cell, but in any case, I was able to modify the rotation of the stepper motor, and I think I've got it working, so let's just do a quick test. Okay, first I'm going to do an extrude. And then I will do a retract. So the retract first extrudes a little bit and then pulls back up. And then quickly pulls up afterward. Okay, that seemed to work. Okay, so let's get some parts going. The purpose here is just to see if swapping the extruder solves the problem. So let's go through some prints of different materials and see if that helps at all. Since I've already calibrated these materials in the last video, I'm just going to reuse those values, and for anything new, I will do a PA test, pressure advance test. And again, I've printed the same part on my K1 using the same exact Cruiserman PETG as well, just so we can compare. I have had good results on all my printers with Orca Slicer, so all of these tests will be done through Orca Slicer since the printer is now rooted and I can send it to the printer wirelessly. I have not calibrated the extruder yet, so in the config file I referenced the extruder for the K1 and I was able to match the rotation distance from 7.53 and change it to 6.9, and then we'll rerun the parts. Now obviously we don't have enough cooling, so I've added a separate fan beside the printer. We're seeing the same result as the original extruder, so I've swapped the nozzle back to the original that came with the printer. So again, the same results. Let's try out Hyper PLA that we had pretty good results with in the previous video. We're also going to try out Sparkle PLA. While all this is set up, I'm just going to run some no-name PETG as well that I've dried. And I've also run a series of tests using Bamboo Green Basic PLA. Even though I'm using the extruder from the K1 and the hot end is effectively the same as what is on the K1, we're still seeing the same issues as the previous test. The nozzle swap didn't seem to have any impact on the results, and I wouldn't really expect it to, since this hot end is capable of extruding far beyond the speeds that we're running this printer at. So from what I can tell, we have made no progress whatsoever with the extruder. Let's swap it back to the original setup, and at least we can get our part cooling back and we can move on from there. So there are a few things that keep on coming to mind. The K1 produces good results and consistent results with the exact same parts. So what is left? What is the difference? The issues seem to be more common with PETG. PETG is a little bit strange when it comes to the nozzle rubbing on the filament as it's being extruded. So it could be somehow related to this. I also have another hunch, and it's going to require me to test two parts at the exact same time. This is something I have not done with this printer yet. So is it possible that we're going to see different results depending on where the parts are positioned on the printer? And if this is the case, it may explain why the results aren't completely consistent. So in the previous video, I had some really good results with black PETG, and all of the other PETG prints were not that good. They were positioned in different places on the build plate. So let's get two test pieces going, and one of them is going to be positioned towards the front and the other one is going to be positioned in the middle, and we'll see if we can prove this theory. So I've been watching the printer and I think I can see what's happening. It's a little bit too fast to see clearly, but the carriage is vibrating. The model towards the front is definitely showing some of the worst results of this problem that I've been having. And this is also bamboo PLA, so it is not just an issue with material. This is an issue with the poor fit of the linear bearings on the rods. And now it is finally making sense to me. When I printed the black PETG and I had really good results in the last video, the part was centered. When I printed the other PETG models, they were towards the front of the bed, even though the one in the middle does still show some very slight signs of it. So if that's the case, we can try our own solution to the problem, and I don't expect it's going to work perfectly, but I would like to see at least an improvement or also just a difference, because if there's at least a difference, we can be definitive that the movement and vibrations of the bed are the source of the problem. I'll salvage some parts from my Ender 3 version 2 so that we can build our own bearing blocks of a different type. I'll take the wheels over to the lathe, but first I need a mandrel so we can machine this piece of brass down to fit inside of the wheels perfectly. And I can also attach them with a washer and a bolt. I can then machine a concave shape into each of the 6 of them, and that will allow them to hug onto the rods properly. And I'm just eyeballing these since this is just a test, and I'm also going to be building in some adjustment to this mechanism. With all of those pieces finished, I can add the bearings back in. All right, so this is my solution. So I have these 2 ABS blocks. This is the eccentric nut, which allows some adjustability in these wheels. Yes, I could have designed it without that, but I figured it'd be better to have some adjustability so that I could bring everything just to the right amount of tightness against these rails. So this is not a final solution. This is just a test. So let's go ahead and get these prepped. First thing I need to do is to tap these 2 holes. This one here with the eccentric is going to sit in here, and it's going to have a nut on the top. Because I had to raise this up, I've had to add this extension because this was the screw originally which activated the switch. And then this is the mount which spaces off for the belt. All right, guys. So before, if I pressed on here, I'd get movement at the front, and I didn't realize, and I guess it was an assumption because of the weight just pushing down, it was also lifting up and moving down. And if you pressed out here, it would easily move up and down. Now we can go ahead and test this out. Now I'm not quite sure about the probing because the Z height is going to be so far off. Hopefully the Z height will be accounted for with the probe up here. Let's go ahead and get that set up. And I'm under no assumption that this is going to be anywhere close to level. It's probably going to be quite a bit further off than what we had originally. But that's okay. I'm just going to rely on the bed leveling to take care of that, as long as it's not out by too far. So I'm going to preheat the bed to 60. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and clear out the bed level that's in there right now because it's actually pretty close. And then we'll redo it and see how close they are. Okay, so the bed is out on the front by quite a bit, unfortunately. So I'm just going to add spacers underneath here. Okay, so we're going to do another test. We have one in the middle, one off to the corner, the exact same test as the last time using the same filament. This is not an ideal setup whatsoever. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the wheels very far apart, but I was limited by this area here, so the wheels would have come and hit this. Also, how high I had to raise this in order to use the existing hardware from my Ender 3. So this should have been quite a bit further down, and that way this wouldn't wobble as much. Also, the linear bearing does have a lot less friction than the setup that I have. So when it moves to the front, we are seeing some vibration. It's really probably just a combination of the setup that I have and the fact that this is so high. But we should still see better results in the middle than we're seeing out here. Well, I screwed up a little bit. After the green prints had finished, I tested the flex again while looking really closely underneath there, and I noticed that the wheel at the back on this side and the wheel at the front on this side were not quite making perfect contact. So I've tightened them up. I'm going to do another print. Well, let's see how we did. So these three samples were printed with linear bearings. These samples over here were printed with the wheels set up, and I've got them marked front or middle. We have the middle with the linear bearings. The results were not too bad. And you can see here, it's kind of a rough textured surface, and if I take a look at the PETG version, it shows it off far better. I'm not 100% convinced that the material does not impact this, but it seems as though it's lesser of an issue than the movement itself. Okay, so then we can compare the green with the wheeled setup versus the green with the bearings. And the results are pretty close. Towards the front, that's a little bit of a different story. The results are quite a bit different. This is towards the front with linear bearings. We have that rough surface. And this one was more of a rubbery look. We've lost the crisp edges and it looks as though it's melting. So definitely we have completely different results. Neither one of them are really acceptable. And then I have PETG. Again, this one looks as though it's kind of giving that melted look to it as well, somewhat rounded edges. And then we have the front, and it's even more so the case. This one looks as though it's melting completely. It's almost as if it's made of rubber. So the edges are too rounded over, see some undulations, but it's nothing like the results that we see here. So PETG, this one's PETG as well. Okay, so obviously my solution wasn't perfect. I wanted to whip these together from what I had in my shop, but what we can see with no other changes than these bearing blocks that I added, we have pretty good results again near the center of the build plate, and the piece towards the front is impacted by that movement and vibration. But this time it was a little bit different than the linear bearings, and it was more of a spongy spring-like motion as opposed to more sharp movements. After going through this process and learning quite a bit, I understand now they chose to use a steel carriage rather than an aluminum carriage below the heat bed because of its stiffness, and they've used linear bearings because they minimize the friction and allow really quick movements to be possible. So what is the right final solution here now that we know the problem? Well, there are two options that I can see working. One is to replace these rods with the correct 8mm or slightly over 8mm rods, and having a bit of preload here on the bearings would probably be a good thing to keep everything as stiff as possible. But the better option is to use linear rails, and I don't have the parts to retrofit anything onto my printer in this video. But if you'd like to see that option used, give this video a like and leave a comment, and I will get the parts and make a follow-up video to this video. The problem seems so obvious now looking back at it. I remember thinking that the side-to-side motion of the bed was a problem, but the up and down was not a problem because of the weight of the bed keeping it down. Unfortunately, that's not quite true, because with the faster speeds of this printer, it will want to lift or fall depending on which direction it's going. And although the wheels that we were seeing on some of the older printers weren't really ideal for fast-moving printers because they have more friction, they do allow some adjustment to keep them tight. And they also had a longer central guide rail, which meant that the wheels were spaced further apart for even more stability. So if you have this problem and you want the best results right now, print in the middle of the bed for every single part. But if you want a long-term solution, I'd recommend swapping out for linear rails. So if I've made a video about installing the linear rails on this printer, it will be linked up above here. Make sure that you like and subscribe if you are enjoying this type of content, and hit that notification bell as well so you always know when a new video is released. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you to all of my patrons for helping to support this channel and making videos like this possible. Take care everybody, and we will see you on the next one.